Inkat insaik u Dios boti kilti Wayne Modest tu mentu paitan nahen utira insaik letzik bala titulaklesh hachkima kin wol wayan melai ins iwoltik hebasha kiyan intik baltikesh yanubilal utial utsabal tumben tukulob ichele meya hob tambeti kesho. I would like to start by thanking Wayne Modest for the invitation he made to me to speak to you in this room, in this occasion. And I'm very happy to be here with you all today. And I wish that whatever I'm going to be talking about in this brief time is going to be of any use to you in any kind of work that you are doing. This presentation has fundamentally two intentions. On the one hand, I want to share some insights that I have gained over the years about how time and space are inscribed in dominant representations of indigenous communities and people, that is, individual persons in Mexico. On the other hand, I want to try here some ideas about fruitful ways of curating indigenous arts while also interrogating the possibilities that performance and many other media can give us in accomplishing this enterprise. So first, a reflection. I can't really remember the first time that I went to an ethnographic museum, and I don't think that there's an ethnographic museum in the Yucatan, or there wasn't one when I was a kid. There is a deposit, a storage deposit of archaeological remains that were turned into a museum at the beginning of the 20th century, and it was set up in the Palacio Canton, which was a maisonette in one of the most colonial cities in southern Mexico, which is Mérida, or also known for its Maya name, Ho. And in this Palacio Canton, the Canton Palace, what you will find will be some pieces of information, very fragmented pieces of information, and a history that will establish that the Maya started at some point 2,000 years before Christ, before our age, and they basically finished, they were done around 1546 when the city of Mérida was founded, according to the regional mythology. And later on, when I moved to Mexico City, I started seeing some of the spaces where ethnographic objects or indigenous forms of art were displayed, like the Indigenous Museum in Mexico City, which has the particularity nowadays that they're trying many things in this museum. This space has a very young director, and he has been trying some different things basically with objects by displaying them in new fashionable ways, but most of the times without allowing the direct voices of indigenous artists themselves to be present in the room. And there was a curious incident about a year ago when they organized a cine club that will show one movie every other Thursday for a couple of months. And a friend of mine went to this museum, and she was just outraged that the kind of movies that they were showing, it was something like Back to the Future 1, Back to the Future 2, Back to the Future 3, and none of the many audiovisual works that a lot of indigenous video makers or filmmakers are now experimenting with. So for me, that just shows how connected these ethnographic museums are with indigenous realities. Nowadays, one of the most vibrant and dynamic places in Mexico City, particularly, which is the city where I live now, is the museum, the National Museum of Popular Cultures. And here, popular culture is like an umbrella concept that absorbs and encompasses both mestizo art forms, or traditional art forms, urban, poor, mestizo art forms, as well as indigenous creations. And So the National Museum of Popular Cultures was actually created by an anthropologist, Guillermo Batalla, who was an ally of indigenous organizations in the 80s, late 70s, 1980s. He was the director of the center, research center where I work now, and he was very open to. I mean, he was very vocal in the enterprise of reincorporating indigenous artistic forms to the canon, to the nationalist canon, so to speak, of identity representations in Mexico. So he was very instrumental in creating this space for popular art forms, but the museum has a lot of issues, and again, you know, it focuses on canonical pieces of art and always portrays indigenous art form as tradition. Right, it is the main idea behind popular cultures. It's just recently, and you can see on your right hand side that there is a graffiti mural, right? And this graffiti mural was recently commissioned to celebrate the 200 years of independence. In 2010, we celebrated 200 years of independence from Spain. And so the director commissioned this graffiti mural, which celebrates the work of indigenous artisans in a very modern sort of, or rather postmodern way. But this is perhaps one of the first attempts at changing or kind of subverting the way in which indigenous art forms are represented or displayed in this museum. And it all takes us back to this mammoth of a museum, the National Museum of Anthropology, which is basically a national museum of archaeology, right? And which is, you know, it has the status of a World Heritage building. It has been protected, and it's in many ways is the temple for mestizo nationalist narratives. For those of you who are not familiar with the Mexican cultural politics, mestizaje or mixed racedness is the foundation of the nation, right? It's been believed by many Mexicans that we all Mexicans have a little bit of Amerindians, a little bit of Europeans, and that makes the unique fabric of the whole of Mexican society. And this temple, this museum, sort of celebrates that. But by celebrating the indigenous past in such a grand way, with such grandeur, it also raises the temporalities of present indigenous lives, and this is laid out particularly in the building itself. You know, in the lower ground, what you have, you know, we probably don't see this, but you know, and I apologize for that. But in the lower ground, what you have is these rooms, these magnificent rooms, where all the artwork from pre-Columbian indigenous societies are displayed. But if you notice, if you look closely, you can see that all of these rooms and the pieces of work that they show are dated. So there is a sense of the moving past. The past was always moving. There was a beginning of the nation. There was this prehistoric time when everything started, and you know, we were all running. In a way, indigenous societies were running to their own destruction, because most of these rooms end in 1521. So that's the fatal expiring date for all these societies. And when you go to the ethnographic museum, what you have, it's this layout where you have effectively, and we were discussing with Philip the other day that, you know, a lot has changed in terms of how contemporary indigenous societies are shown, are displayed in these rooms. But basically, what marks these new societies is location. So there's a sense of a static, a territorial fixation of indigenous communities that, you know, in a way establishes a canonical way of representing them in different spaces, different artistic spaces. So when we look back to all these different ethnographic museum strategies of representing indigenous art, we have this. Indigenous art is almost always referenced, defined by archaeological time, and it's always imagined as tradition. So everything that is innovation is generally rejected or is seen with suspicion in all of these exhibitions. The indigenous art is presented as an object. There's no agent behind the object, or the agent is not apparent. It's always the object that defines the culture and the society, but not the people, the ones that define the object and the society. There is a contradiction between the pre-Hispanic, which is more dynamic or is seen as dynamic, it has history inscribed in it, whereas the post-colonial is a suspended time. And the grand narrative behind this is the great calamity that European colonization brought upon indigenous societies. And again, indigenous art is always geographically attached. It belongs to places, and it's the places that define indigenous art and not the people behind these artworks. And there's a constant tension between popular culture seen as traditional, as genuine, as legitimate, as ethnographically verifiable, and mass culture, which is seen as a contamination, right? Generally, the graffiti artwork and many of the other creations that young indigenous people do are not allowed within this canon of representation. And finally, the indigenous artist, or rather the indigenous artisan, it's always defined by his or her precariousness. You know, they live in poor rural communities. They do work that is template-based, is repetitive, is patterned after old models, and is anonymous. Right? There's no sense of personal creativity there, and this has been. I mean, this is still the case. You know, for instance, a recent exhibition of 8 regions of the state of Guerrero, which has if you have heard words like Ayotzinapa, no? Probably you have heard about the 43 students who were kidnapped by police forces in the state of Guerrero, and then they were disappeared and nobody knows where they are. Then you know that Ayotzinapa was in Guerrero. And as a response on the part of the government, they created this sort of celebration of indigenous cultures, because most of these students were indigenous, and they created this exhibition, 8 regions of Guerrero. It was a very beautiful exhibition, and it showed beautiful objects created by indigenous artisans. And but again, what you don't see there is the agent of all this work. You see the objects, and it's as if the objects could speak for themselves. And the way in which the canonical representation form of the National Museum of Anthropology displayed indigenous cultures in the past, not so much in the present, although I acknowledge that I haven't been in the museum since 14 years ago. But this model has even been adopted by other cultural endeavors. So you probably have heard about this festival, which is called the Tajín Summit. It's a popular culture festival with popular musicians, singers, and so on. But what anchors the festival is is a space that has been created, which is called the Indigenous Art Center. And the Indigenous Art Center consists of 7 houses. Each house represents a certain craft from the Totonac people, which is the indigenous people of the region, and they are the houses during the festival. They are presented as living dioramas, right? So the Totonac people go there, they dress in their traditional attires, and they welcome the tourists. They show the tourists around, they explain the tourists, the culture behind it. It has some captions, it has some exhibits, and you see life as it was supposed to be about 50 years ago, but all of this is represented as suspended in time. There's no conflict, there's no colonization, there's not that exploration of the different problems, how Totonac identity has had to be fought for by these indigenous communities against mining or against oil extraction or against any of the current illnesses of modernity. And is it as if everything was, everything exists in these pristine conditions, and nothing has happened since the times of colonization. So this is, and this, what really worries me is that this model, the model of the Indigenous Art Center in Tajín or Papantla, has been adopted by UNESCO as how they call it, as good practice in terms of safeguarding the intangible cultural heritage. So this is the model that is being promoted, and I was invited to go to this festival, and they asked me, "What do you think?" And I said, I have problems with this exhibition, because where's the history? Where's the dynamic? Where's the present in this exhibition? And there's nothing about that. And they say, no, but if we start talking about problems, then the tourists aren't going to come. And that was their very pragmatic response to that. So what to do in these conditions? Well, I mean, what sort of anchors this idea is that indigenous people are basically remnants of the past. So this is something that I picked up 1 week ago. I was watching the news in this public television channel, Canal 11, which is the Politécnico, the National Polytechnic Institute, and they were interviewing the general director of the commission, the National Commission for the Development of Indigenous Peoples, a woman who is quite inept at understanding, what indigenous causes, demands are all about. So what she basically said is, it's our mission to work for the benefit of our indigenous communities, right? The communities are ours, and we must remember always. She was advertising a fair, an artisans fair that was taking place in Mexico City, one of the main avenues, the Reforma Avenue in downtown Mexico, one of the most beautiful avenues in Mexico City. And she was saying, you must remember that indigenous communities are only those, indigenous peoples are only those who live in rural communities. So there's no urban indigenous people. That's one thing. And the other thing that she said is that we have organized these artisans fairs in DF, so that people in the city can get an opportunity to meet these indigenous artisans in person, these people who are our ancestors. So living indigenous people are still seen as the ancestral essence of Mexico, right? So all of that. So how to approach that? I mean, for me, all of this reflection, all of this analysis has. I was working in a project at Royal Holloway, University of London, with Professor Helen Gilbert, who is a performance studies scholar, and one of the main things that we did as part of the project, the research project, was to organize an exhibition of indigenous arts, indigenous contemporary arts, and we obviously focused on those indigenous art forms that were based on performance, right? So it was the exhibition was called Ecocentrics, and the byline was Indigenous Arts, Sustainable Acts, and it was mostly about ecologies of resistance. I mean, there was an element of sustainability as well, but we didn't want to exoticize sustainability as something that only indigenous people do, but rather something that interests a lot of people. And here we wanted to sort of tap into the ephemeral nature, but also the cultural endurance of indigenous performance. We used material objects as traces of movement, so many of the things that were displayed were props, but also objects that come alive, in festivals, in contemporary events that indigenous activists organize in Guatemala, in Chile, in the Pacific Islands, and Aotearoa, and so on. So we were trying to inspire in the public an interest in these contemporary indigenous forms that are hybrids by nature, but that are also they draw from these indigenous epistemologies. So there was an exploration. We had live performances, but also mostly objects. And in the whole exhibition, one thing that was interesting is we never defined indigeneity. Indigeneity was to be defined by the spectator, by the exhibition attendant. So it was constantly a moving target, because we also had some pieces of humor and some pieces of there was a presence, there was absence. We were playing with different ideas, but mostly around how indigenous people inhabit their identities by playing them out in the open, right? So one of the things I'm not going to talk about, there were 40 different artists from the 5 continents, from Oceania, Africa. We didn't have anybody from Asia, but there were people from Guatemala, from Chile, from different places. And some of the exhibits were more powerful. They draw more attention from people. No? So for instance, there was this exhibit that commemorated the disappearance of indigenous women in Canada and the United States, right? There is a disproportionate amount of indigenous women among women who have disappeared, who have been kidnapped, who have basically have suffered domestic violence, and or who have been trafficked. And then, so we didn't show traditional attires or anything, but rather this idea that the indigenous female body is still a target, and is a target of sex slave traffickers and so on. So the absent body was, the absence of the bodies, of indigenous bodies in these dresses was, the most powerful message. And in what I was concerned, my participation as a curator, because I was basically an anthropologist, helping sort of frame some of these artworks. But one of the things that I did have a direct involvement in was the maize exhibit, where we were sort of reflecting on the Maya indigenous movements in Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize, and how they have sort of incorporated maize as the substance of their struggles. And so maize in this sort of work of representation that I helped to create was seen as a body of resistance. And the Zapatista, so you can see on the left-hand side, there's an ear of corn. And if you look closer, the kernels are Zapatista faces. And on the right-hand side, you see the Zapatista movement. So this is maize as a body that resists. When I went back to Mexico a couple of years back, I started searching for indigenous contemporary artists, and I found a few, and this second look has taken me away from artisan or handicraft creation and more into the field of conceptual art made by indigenous people. So one of my favorite artists now is Lucas Avendaño, who's basically he's a Mushe person. Mushe is a third gender in Oaxaca, in the isthmus of Tehuantepec. So he sort of uses his performance art to reflect about the vulnerability, not just of female bodies, but also of homosexual bodies in this particular region. So he undresses, he challenges this idea of fixed time, in particularly because some of his performances are basically acts of undressing. He dresses as an indigenous woman, because the Mushe are transgender people, and in the process of presenting his performance work, he undresses basically, and in that way he sheds this static image of time, and he shows his body, his aging body in natural form, and this is a powerful statement about how brown skin bodies represent, they stand for a form of indigeneity by itself. The other, well, he has inspired, for instance, other indigenous artists, and he's the main protagonist, he's the main actor in this painting, which is called The First Tehuayorca, which is basically a migrant person from Tehuantepec who goes to live and work in New York. So he's a Tehuayorca. And he's the first Tehuayorca, and you can see here how his half undressed body still inhabits the Tehuana woman iconic image. He undresses and dresses. He's a half undressed person, but at the same time he still maintains many of these signs of identity. And another artist that I'm interested in is Gearman Ortega, who is an installation artist. She's a conceptual artist, and she intervenes material memory objects like photographs, ethnographic photographs, and she also projects moving images of displacement, of migration, on the body of traditional dresses from this particular region. So she sort of reflects about desolation, she reflects about family ties, but also about mobility, and she challenges this idea that indigenous identity is fixed on a particular place. And finally, from my own homeland, from the Yucatan Peninsula, the Colectivos, Tzaikin, Turish, they do a lot of experimental radio interventions. So in this case, what we're seeing here is a photograph of an installation that they made in a gallery in Mérida, where they combine electronic pads with traces of earth, and they created this sort of rainforest of transistors, showing how integral radio is to the lives of indigenous communities, and how this helps broadcast their voices beyond their immediate community and into the cities and even beyond. So radio here is rescued as both an organic part of indigenous life, and also as a modern part of what they are and what they do. So just to finish up, I'm still working on different ideas about how to use this intervention, these artistic incarnations of indigeneity in Mexico, to create an exhibition of the same kind, or to challenge the ways in which traditionally indigenous art has been represented. And I have called this project, in my mind I call it Wayak Wedge, which means basically this is an armadillo's dream. And I have chosen the armadillo because the armadillo is both within indigenous communities and outside of indigenous communities, an animal that has an ambiguity. I mean, it's an ambiguous animal. It lives overground and lives on the ground, and is constantly hiding, but he's there, and he's part of the land, and is rejected as part of the land, and it smells funny, and some people believe that the armadillo gives you sexual potency, but some other people think that the armadillo is basically something that puts anybody sexually off. So here what I'm trying to do is an anthropological intervention that interrupts traditional representations of indigenous art, and to sort of rescue the value of indigenous performance as an indigenous embodied craft. Indigenous art has always been seen as a handicraft, but here, rather than the hand, I'm interested in the whole body. and how the body acquires presence and can be shown to have this dynamic, the body as voice, as movement, as a gaze, and so on, and deterritorializing indigenous creativity is also detemporalizing indigenous creativity. It inserts indigenous creativity into the modern, or whatever you want to understand for modern, but basically it shows that indigenous identities are mobile and are globally engaged. And we are proceeding very carefully, and I want to make this into a creative collaboration with the indigenous artists. I'm not a curator, and I don't claim to be. So we are taking baby steps and very trying to be very careful about how we create this exhibition. Thank you.